The blood-red sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cottonwood Springs as Pearl Carter stared at the lone figure approaching on horseback, his silhouette dark against the dying light of day. The townspeople had already begun their whispers Mason Quinn was back, and trouble surely rode in with him. Pearl clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching from the porch of her small mercantile as the notorious Cowboy dismounted outside the saloon across the street. Spring of 1878 had brought little comfort to the young widow and her two sons after her husband Thomas's passing the previous winter. At 32, Pearl found herself the sole proprietor of the town's only general store and the sole parent to two rambunctious boys who needed a father's guidance more with each passing day. "That's him, isn't it, Ma?" 10-year-old Samuel peered around her skirts, his younger brother Elijah, just 7, copying his every move. "Yes, that's Mr. Quinn," Pearl replied softly, ushering the boys back inside, "and he's not someone you need to concern yourselves with. But I heard Mr. Willis say he's the fastest gun in 3 territories," Samuel protested, his eyes wide with boyish admiration. Pearl closed the door firmly. "Mr. Willis talks too much. Now help me with these inventory lists before supper." Later that evening, after the boys were tucked into bed, Pearl's closest friend Agnes stopped by, her expression grave. "I saw Quinn rode back into town," Agnes said, settling at Pearl's kitchen table. "Thought you should know that Martha Reynolds has been asking after him." "Seems she's determined to set her cap for him," Pearl shrugged, pouring them both cups of coffee. "That's hardly my concern." Agnes's eyebrows shot up. "Don't play coy with me, Pearl Carter. I've seen how you look at him when he comes to buy supplies, and I've seen how he looks at you too." "He's a customer, nothing more," Pearl insisted, though she couldn't deny the strange flutter in her chest whenever the taciturn Cowboy entered her store. "Besides, everyone knows Mason Quinn can't love. Not after what happened with that rancher's daughter in Colorado." "Men like that are broken inside," Agnes warned. "They might make fine cowboys, but they make terrible husbands. Your boys need stability, not some wandering gunslinger who disappears for months at a time." Pearl nodded, though something inside her rebelled at the simple dismissal of the complex man she'd observed from afar. The boys in the store are all that matter now. The next morning brought Mason Quinn through her door, his tall frame filling the entrance as he removed his hat. The store was empty save for Pearl, who stood behind the counter tallying yesterday's sales. "Madam," he said, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. "Mr. Quinn," Pearl acknowledged, straightening her spine. "What can I help you with today?" He placed a list on the counter, his handwriting surprisingly neat. "Just the usual supplies." Pearl began gathering the items: coffee, beans, bacon, ammunition, tobacco. She worked efficiently, aware of his eyes following her movements. Mason Quinn was a handsome man despite the scar that ran along his jawline and the perpetual furrow between his brows. His dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and his blue eyes seemed to hold secrets he had no intention of sharing. "How long will you be staying in Cottonwood Springs this time?" Pearl asked, breaking the silence. "Not sure." His response was clipped. "Got some business with the railroad company." The door burst open and her sons tumbled in, returning from their morning chores. They skidded to a halt when they spotted Mason. "Boys, mind your manners," Pearl chided gently. Samuel stepped forward, extending his hand like the little man he was trying to be. "I'm Samuel Carter, sir. This is my brother Elijah." A flicker of something perhaps surprise crossed Mason's face before he shook the boy's hand. "Mason Quinn. Are you really a cowboy?" Elijah asked, eyes wide. "Do you chase outlaws and Indians, Elijah?" Pearl scolded. "No, madam, it's all right," Mason said, the corner of his mouth twitching. "I mostly chase cattle, young man, sometimes horses. Outlaws and Indians generally have better things to do than be chased by the likes of me." Elijah looked disappointed, but Samuel studied Mason intently. "My pa used to work cattle before he opened this store with Ma. He died of pneumonia last winter." Pearl felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at her son's forthright declaration, but Mason merely nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, his eyes meeting Pearl's briefly. "A good man, I take it, the best," Samuel declared proudly. Mason paid for his supplies and tipped his hat. "Madam, boys." And then he was gone, the bell above the door tinkling in his wake. "He's not as scary as everyone says," Samuel observed thoughtfully. Pearl sighed. "People are rarely what others say they are, Samuel. Now help your brother sweep the storeroom." The next few days brought unusual activity to Cottonwood Springs. The railroad survey team had arrived, and with them came talks of expansion, new businesses, and progress. Pearl found herself both excited and apprehensive about the changes that might come to their small community. She was closing up the store one evening when Mason appeared again, this time with a strange request. "I need a book," he stated. Shifting uncomfortably, Pearl blinked in surprise. "A book? What kind of book?" "Something with stories, for children," he cleared his throat. "I met a family at the edge of town, settlers heading west. The mother's sick and the children looked bored." Pearl studied him, seeing beyond the gruff exterior for perhaps the first time. "Wait here." She disappeared into the back room and returned with a well-loved copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. "My boys have read this 3 times already. I'm sure these children would enjoy it." Mason reached for his wallet, but Pearl shook her head. "It's a gift for the children." Their fingers brushed as she handed him the book, and Pearl felt a spark of connection that startled her. Mason's eyes widened slightly, suggesting he'd felt it too. "Much obliged," he murmured, tucking the book carefully into his saddlebag. After he left, Pearl leaned against the counter, her heart racing inexplicably. This wasn't the cold-hearted drifter everyone warned about. This was a man bringing books to bored children. The contradiction intrigued her more than it should. 2 days later, disaster struck. Pearl was awakened in the dead of night by shouts and the acrid smell of smoke. Grabbing her shawl, she rushed outside to discover that a fire had broken out in the livery stable and was spreading quickly toward the adjacent buildings, including her store and home. "Samuel, Elijah." She cried, racing back inside to gather her sleepy, confused boys. "We need to leave now." The town had formed a bucket brigade, but the flames were moving too fast. Pearl watched in horror as sparks drifted dangerously close to her roof. "Get back." Sheriff Davis shouted, pulling people away from the growing inferno. Pearl stood helplessly in the street, her boys clutching her nightgown as everything they owned faced destruction. Suddenly, Mason Quinn was beside her. "Your store has a back entrance, yes?" he asked urgently. Pearl nodded, bewildered. "What's most important to save? What can't be replaced?" "The deed to the property," she answered without hesitation. "My husband's pocket watch, the boys' birth certificates, they're in a metal box in the bedroom wardrobe." Before she could protest, Mason was running toward the building, ducking low under the smoke. "Mason, no," Pearl screamed, but her voice was lost in the chaos. Endless minutes passed. The boys cried against her, and neighbors offered comforting words she couldn't hear. Just as Pearl had given up hope, a figure emerged from the back alley, carrying a metal box and a small bundle of clothing. Mason staggered toward them, his face blackened with soot, coughing violently. He thrust the box into Pearl's trembling hands. "Grabbed some of the boys' clothes too," he wheezed. "You could have been killed," Pearl said, tears streaming down her face. Mason's gaze met hers, intense despite his obvious discomfort. "Some things are worth the risk." By dawn, the fire was contained, but Pearl's store and home had suffered significant damage. The roof had partially collapsed and water had ruined much of her inventory. She sat on a bench outside the church, which had become a temporary shelter, her sons finally asleep beside her. "Mrs. Carter." Mason approached, cleaned up but still bearing a red mark on his cheek where the heat had burned him. "The doctor's looking for volunteers to house those displaced by the fire. I've offered my cabin." Pearl stared at him. "Your cabin? It's not much, but it's dry and safe." "About 2 miles outside town." He shifted awkwardly. "It would just be until repairs can be made." "I couldn't impose. I'll stay in the barn," he interjected quickly. "You and the boys would have privacy." Pearl hesitated, considering her limited options. The church was already overcrowded, and her meager savings wouldn't cover a prolonged stay at the boarding house. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn. We accept your generous offer." Mason's cabin was indeed modest, a single room with a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, and a narrow bed, but it was clean and well maintained. A bookshelf held a surprising number of volumes, and a guitar rested in one corner. "You play?" Pearl asked, gesturing to the instrument as Mason carried in their few salvaged belongings. He shrugged. "Poorly, but it passes the time." The boys, initially subdued by the traumatic night, soon began exploring their temporary home with growing enthusiasm. "Ma, there's a creak out back." Samuel called from outside. "And Mr. Quinn has horses." "2 horses," Mason corrected, setting down Pearl's metal box. "Old Ramai and a younger mare named Juniper." "Can we ride them?" Elijah asked hopefully. Mason glanced at Pearl, deferring to her authority. She nodded, grateful for any distraction from their current situation. "The mare is gentle enough for beginners," Mason said. "I'll show you both how to approach her properly after lunch." True to his word, Mason moved his few personal items to the small barn and gave the family space to settle in. Over the next few days, a rhythm developed. Mason would rise before dawn to tend to his chores, then ride into town to help with the rebuilding efforts. Pearl and the boys would prepare meals and keep the cabin tidy. In the evenings, Mason taught the boys how to care for the horses, how to track animals, and how to whittle simple shapes from wood. Pearl watched the transformation in her sons with a mixture of gratitude and unease. They were flourishing under Mason's quiet guidance, soaking up his knowledge of the outdoors and practical skills their merchant father had never possessed. But she couldn't forget the warnings. Mason Quinn wasn't a permanent fixture. He was a drifter who would eventually move on. One evening, after the boys were asleep, Pearl found Mason sitting on the porch steps, staring at the stars. "They're exhausted," she said softly, settling beside him. "Samuel couldn't even finish his story about the rabbit tracks you showed him." Mason smiled faintly. "They're good boys." "Smart, too. They adore you," Pearl admitted. "I should probably caution them against getting too attached." Mason's smile faded. "Probably wise." Pearl studied his profile in the moonlight. "Why do you do it? Live this way, always moving, never putting down roots." He was silent for so long that Pearl thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he sighed. "Freedom, I suppose, or at least that's what I tell myself." "And what's the truth?" His blue eyes found hers. "The truth is I'm not fit for much else, not anymore, because of what happened in Colorado." Pearl asked hesitantly. Mason's expression hardened. "Town gossip travels fast. People talk, especially about those who keep to themselves." "And what do they say about me, Mrs. Carter?" Pearl swallowed. "That you were engaged to a rancher's daughter, that she died tragically. That you couldn't bear to stay after that, so you wander, never letting yourself get close to anyone again." Mason stared into the darkness. "Her name was Rebecca, and she didn't just die, she was murdered by a man who was aiming for me." His voice was flat, emotionless. "So yes, I wander. Because getting close to people only ends in heartache, for them or for me." Pearl felt a chill despite the mild spring night. "I'm sorry for your loss. It was a long time ago." "Some wounds never fully heal," Pearl said softly, thinking of her own grief for Thomas. Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment, Pearl felt a connection deeper than words. Then Mason stood abruptly. "It's late. You should rest." As Pearl lay awake that night, she realized she was walking a dangerous path. Mason Quinn might be good with her boys, might have saved their precious belongings from the fire, might even be kinder than his reputation suggested, but he was still a man determined to remain unattached. Her heart had no business yearning for what could never be. The next morning brought news from town. The rebuilding committee had assessed the damage to Pearl's store and home, estimating it would take at least 6 weeks to make it habitable again. 6 weeks, Pearl repeated, dismayed. She couldn't impose on Mason's hospitality for that long. "Perhaps the boarding house, you'll stay here," Mason said firmly. "The boys are settled and it makes no sense to uproot them again." "I can't ask that of you." "You didn't ask, I offered." His tone brooked no argument. "Besides, I'll be gone for a week or so." The railroad needs cattle moved from the southern pastures. Pearl felt an unexpected pang at the thought of his departure. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow at first light." Mason hesitated. "Will you and the boys be comfortable here alone?" "We'll manage," Pearl assured him, though the cabin already felt colder at the prospect of his absence. Mason's departure left a strange emptiness in the cabin. The boys moped for the first day, then gradually adjusted, continuing to care for the horses as he taught them and practicing their whittling skills. Pearl threw herself into creating a temporary schoolroom at the kitchen table, determined to keep their education progressing despite their displacement. 4 days after Mason left, a spring storm swept through the area. Rain pounded the roof, and lightning cracked across the sky. The boys huddled with Pearl in the bed, jumping at each thunderclap. "When will Mr. Quinn be back?" Elijah whispered, clutching his wooden horse carving. "Soon," Pearl promised, praying it was true. "Try to sleep now." The storm continued through the night and into the next day. By evening, the creek behind the cabin had swollen dangerously, and Pearl began to worry about flooding. She was checking the cabin's foundation when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Mason appeared through the curtain of rain, soaked to the skin and mud splattered, but his face relaxed with visible relief when he saw Pearl and the boys safe on the porch. "The creek's rising," he called over the storm's roar. "We need to move the horses to higher ground." Together, they led Ramai and Juniper to a sheltered ridge, then rushed back to the cabin where the boys waited anxiously. Mason built up the fire while Pearl prepared hot coffee and stew. "The cattle drive ended early," he explained, accepting the steaming mug gratefully. "Too dangerous with the rivers rising. I was worried about the creek here." "We're glad you came back," Samuel said earnestly. Mason's eyes met Pearl's over the rim of his cup. "So am I." That night, despite Pearl's protests, Mason slept on the floor near the stove, refusing to return to the barn through the downpour. In the dim firelight, Pearl watched his chest rise and fall rhythmically, struck by how right it felt to have him there, protecting them. The storm passed, but something had shifted between them. Mason began teaching Pearl to shoot, insisting she needed to protect herself and the boys when he wasn't around. Their hands touched as he adjusted her grip on the revolver, and neither pulled away immediately. At dinner, their eyes met more often, lingering longer. When Mason played his guitar in the evenings, his gaze would find Pearl's as he sang old ballads in his surprisingly rich voice. The boys noticed too. Pearl overheard Samuel telling Elijah, "Ma smiles more when Mr. Quinn is around." One Saturday, Mason suggested they all ride to a nearby lake for a picnic. The day was perfect warm sunshine, gentle breeze, wildflowers dotting the meadows. The boys splashed in the shallows while Pearl and Mason sat on a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "The store repairs are almost complete," Pearl said, watching her sons with contentment. "Sheriff Davis says we can move back next week." Mason nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's good news." "Yes," Pearl agreed, though her heart wasn't in it. These weeks at the cabin had been some of the happiest since Thomas died, despite the circumstances that brought them here. "The boys will miss this place," she added carefully. "They've thrived here." "Children adapt quickly," Mason replied, plucking a blade of grass. "They'll be happy to be home." "And what about you?" Pearl asked, gathering her courage. "Will you be leaving once we're gone?" Mason was silent for a long moment. "I've stayed in Cottonwood Springs longer this time than ever before. Because of the fire, the rebuilding." His blue eyes found hers, intense and searching. "You know that's not why, Pearl." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent a shiver through her. "The boys adore you," she said softly, "and their mother," Pearl's heart pounded. "Their mother has been warned repeatedly that Mason Quinn can't love, that he's broken inside. That he'll never settle down." Mason moved closer, his hand covering hers on the blanket. "And what does Pearl Carter believe?" "I believe." She swallowed hard. "I believe that people can heal, that the heart knows what it wants, regardless of warnings." Before he could respond, shouts from the lake drew their attention. Elijah had ventured too far and was struggling in deeper water. Samuel was trying to reach him but couldn't swim well enough himself. Mason was on his feet in an instant, racing toward the water. He dove in without hesitation, powerful strokes carrying him swiftly to Elijah. Pearl watched in terror as he grabbed her son and pulled him toward shore, then went back for Samuel, who had begun to panic as well. Minutes later, both boys were safe on the beach, coughing and frightened but unharmed. Pearl clutched them to her, tears streaming down her face. "You're all right now," Mason soothed, kneeling beside them, water dripping from his clothes. "But no more swimming without an adult in the water with you. Understand, The boys nodded solemnly, chastened by their close call. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Pearl found Mason on the porch again, staring at the stars. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "If you hadn't been there today." "But I was," he interrupted gently. "And they're fine." Pearl sat beside him, closer than before. "You were right, about why you've stayed in Cottonwood Springs so long." Mason turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "I told myself it was just until you and the boys were settled again, that I was just helping neighbors in need. And now," he took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Now I can't imagine riding away from here, from them." His eyes held hers. "From you." Pearl's heart soared, but caution held her back. "Mason, I need to know, is this real? Because my boys have lost one father already. I can't let them love you if you're going to disappear at the first sign of trouble." "I've been running for 6 years," he admitted. "Telling myself I was protecting others by staying detached, but watching you with your sons, seeing your strength and love. It made me realize what I've been missing." He squeezed her hand. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes, but I can promise I won't run anymore." Pearl searched his face, finding only sincerity in his eyes. Slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with longing and promise. "The town will talk," she whispered when they finally parted. Mason chuckled. "Let them. They've been wrong about me before." The next week brought Pearl and her sons back to their rebuilt home above the store. The community had rallied impressively, not only repairing the damaged buildings, but improving them in the process. Pearl's inventory had been restocked through donations from neighboring towns, and business quickly resumed. Mason remained at his cabin, riding into town daily to help with final construction projects and to spend time with Pearl and the boys. Tongues wagged, of course. Martha Reynolds sniffed disapprovingly when Mason escorted Pearl to church. Agnes worried aloud that Pearl was setting herself up for heartbreak. "He's different now," Pearl told her friend as they sat in the mercantile's back room, drinking tea. "Or perhaps he was always different from what people believed." Agnes remained skeptical. "Men don't change that fundamentally, Pearl, especially not men with pasts like his." "He saved my boys from drowning," Pearl countered. "He rushes back during storms to make sure we're safe. He teaches Samuel and Elijah things their father never had the chance to." She set down her teacup firmly. "If that's not the foundation of love, I don't know what is." As spring turned to summer, Mason became a fixture in their lives. He built a small addition to Pearl's living quarters, giving the boys a proper bedroom. He helped in the store during busy periods, his presence deterring the occasional rowdy customer. On Sundays, they picnicked as a family, exploring the countryside around Cottonwood Springs. One evening in late July, Mason invited Pearl for a private ride. They stopped at his cabin, which looked strangely empty. "Are you moving?" Pearl asked, a flicker of old fear returning. Mason smiled mysteriously. "In a manner of speaking, come inside." The cabin had been cleaned thoroughly, with fresh curtains at the windows and wildflowers in a jar on the table. A special dinner was laid out with candles waiting to be lit. "Mason, what is this?" He took her hands in his. "I spoke with your boys yesterday. Asked their permission for something important." Pearl's breath caught as Mason lowered himself to one knee. "Pearl Carter, I once thought my heart was too damaged to love again. You and your sons proved me wrong." He withdrew a simple gold ring from his pocket. "I'm not a wealthy man, and I'm still learning how to be the kind of person who deserves you. But if you'll have me, I promise to spend every day trying to be the husband you need and the father those boys deserve." Tears filled Pearl's eyes. "The town said you couldn't love." Mason rose, cupping her face gently. "The town doesn't know my heart like you do." "Yes," Pearl whispered, her voice strengthening. "Yes, I'll marry you, Mason Quinn." They were wed in September, with the entire town in attendance despite the previous misgivings. Even Agnes had come around, grudgingly admitting that Mason's devotion to Pearl and her sons seemed genuine and unwavering. After the ceremony, Sheriff Davis approached the newlyweds with an offer. "Town councils decided we need a permanent deputy," he explained. "Someone steady, who knows the territory and can handle himself. Job's yours if you want it, Quinn." Mason looked at Pearl, who nodded encouragingly. "I think I'm done wandering, Sheriff," he said, shaking the older man's hand. "I accept." That evening, as Pearl and Mason sat on the porch of what was now their home, the boys already asleep inside, she rested her head on his shoulder. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," she assured him. "Though I do wonder what became of that family you brought the book to." The settlers with the sick mother. Mason's lips twitched with amusement. "There was no family." Pearl sat up straight. "What? I wanted an excuse to talk to you," he admitted sheepishly. "I'd seen your boys reading on the store porch, and it seemed like a good opening." Pearl laughed in disbelief. "Mason Quinn, are you saying you made up a story about needy children just to speak with me?" "Not my proudest moment," he conceded, pulling her close again. "But it worked, didn't it?" "It certainly did." Pearl kissed him softly. "And to think they said you couldn't love." Mason smiled against her lips. "They were wrong about a great many things." As stars appeared above Cottonwood Springs, Pearl reflected on the strange path that had brought them together. A fire that could have destroyed everything had instead given her a second chance at happiness. The man the town had labeled a heartless drifter had become the loving husband and father her family needed. Sometimes, Pearl realized, you had to ignore the warnings to find what your heart truly desired.